So what you said about like having so much curiosity kind of triggered something in my mind, a little personal, but I'll tell it. I love sort of his ideology with that. I think I strive for that. And I can remember like growing up, just like everyone always being like, you're so curious, you're such a curious kid and all this stuff. My parents had this ongoing thing every night before bed. I would get to ask them 2 or 3 questions, just any question in the world. And I would continually ask like how things worked, how this happened, how does a toilet work? How does an airplane stay in the air? Like all this stuff. And it's cool to think that like just carrying that into adulthood, like you should be like unabashedly seeking out this kind of stuff, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you're even slightly interested in understanding how something works, like go figure out how it works. It's awesome.
Welcome to episode 202 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss the middle third of Frank Herbert's 1965 novel, Dune. Well, here we are in person. I am in Florida right now, and we're recording sitting right next to each other, which is very odd.
One microphone.
Just 2 boys huddled next to a microphone.
Yes,
as God intended.
That's what the podcast has always been. Yeah,
as prophecy foretold.
Yes.
It's very odd. So if the energy is a little different, if the sound's a little different, that's probably to blame. But we are going to be discussing the middle third of this novel. And this last weekend, I was down here going to my younger brother Ben's bachelor party, where we were down in Tampa, going to some different things and trying to remain as safe as possible, but still having a good time, doing some outdoor stuff. Went to an NFL game, went to on a pedal cab, stuff like that. And then just stealing away moments to read in between, which was a little tricky, especially when it's such a dense project like Dune is. I'm curious, James, what your experience was reading this middle chunk here.
Yeah. I mean, I think you sandbagged a little bit when I first started talking to you about how we needed to read this week. You were like, this is, I think, the shortest bit. It's not the shortest bit.
I didn't mean short.
It's not the shortest bit.
Also, I was apparently wrong.
And but overall, I mean, like, I really enjoyed being back. I did start reading like just a tiny amount after our recording last week, and I was like, because I wanted to get back into it right away. Some big revelations right as we ended the recording, right as we ended our reading last week. So definitely wanted to get into that. And then this time, you know, there's a lot of building that's going on, and you can see some of the characters sort of where they might end up nearing the end of the story. But honestly, It took me on a trip still, because it was unexpected in ways. Like, I expected to get the Fremen stuff, but some of the other stuff that we got surprised me.
Yeah. I mean, we mostly deal a lot with the Fremen, I feel like, in this chunk, right? Like, a lot of Paul meeting with the Fremen and Jessica and starting to learn a little bit about their actual culture. We get a little bit of stuff with the Baron's, what's it, his son? What's it? Freyed.
His, like, nephew, yeah.
Nephew, that's who he is, yeah.
Fade Rotha.
Fade Rotha. Some of these names, man,
yes.
I'm going to butcher. Like, I've heard them, I've read them, and then when it comes time to say them, ooh boy.
Definitely.
And I know there are people out there who read this book like 20 times and have it all, you know, frontwards and backwards memorized, so I apologize as you're screaming at your podcast player. This is our first time through this, so they're very unfamiliar to us. But I do want to shout out, like, we mentioned last week that it's said that this is sort of the Lord of the Rings of science fiction. And I thought that was kind of a throwaway line. Like, Lord of the Rings is the most popular, well-known fantasy historically, right? Like, it's the one that has been around a long time. It's kind of the grandfather of fantasy in many ways. And to liken this to that, I was like, oh, okay, so they're just reaching for the thing that everybody knows. But I think that it goes farther, because the richness of the background, like the stuff that's off the page and just hinted at and implied, and the world building, and we get just tastes of like the culture and it's like thousands and thousands of years of this galactic empire. And so much of it isn't explained. It's just given us little breadcrumbs. And that's the kind of stuff that Tolkien does so much of, right? And if you want to be a super nerd about it and get into all that stuff, there's a lot there. And so I can imagine there's probably a lot of people who love to get into all those details and know the inner workings of all these different houses and different factions within this empire. Whereas as to a new reader, it's doled out in small chunks. And I like that it's not completely overwhelming, even if at times it can come close to that.
I was going to say, with the amount of time that we had to read this section, it did feel overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah.
And with characters and sort of some glancing looks at backstories and especially the Bene Gesserit stuff is like, it feels so ancient. And then their powers are so, like, it seems like every couple chapters we get more abilities that they have. And it seems like it's clearly just magic, but it's also like a religion, and then some of the time some of the stuff that they're doing is a little false, so it's not clear, it's not all powerful as they would have you believe. Like even Paul, like I mentioned at the end of last episode, how he's going to be this just like all powerful character going forward, and it's going to be tough to write a character that knows everything and is just unstoppable. And I think Herbert does a good job of like making him struggle and not in control of his powers fully through these parts. And you can kind of see him start to get more of that. But the big monkey wrench is when he ingests spice at any point, because then he starts to like sort of lose his grip, but then become like increasingly more powerful. So I don't know, some of that stuff kind of threw me for a loop too.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? He has to walk the line of having a character who is clearly fitting into this chosen one archetype that we see so often in fantasy and science fiction, and but find a way to make him interesting. And I like that he pushes back on his role a little bit. Like he is afraid of these visions of warfare.
Well, he's seen seemingly like one outcome, and I love the part where it's talked about how every decision that he makes, he can sort of see many different ramifications all along his journey so far. And it's crazy to think that like he's constantly just trying to find the one outcome. It reminds me of like Endgame, where they're like, there's one outcome where we succeed. He's like, there's one outcome of Paul's life where he goes through everything on Arrakis and finds a way to not have like a jihad, right?
Yeah, jihad. Yeah, that's the thing he's worried about, right? This long, bloody jihad that he keeps predicting, and he knows that he is going to be a key figure in. But he also starts to suspect his mother, Jessica, is going to be sort of primary in causing this jihad to happen. And he doesn't want to necessarily have this big bloody war be something that he's going to spearfront. And I like that he is resistant to that, although I suspect it won't matter ultimately, and he's going to do it. But, you know, I'm fascinated to see how he handles that going forward. Like, I like the idea of a leader who maybe is a reluctant warrior, but who has peace as his ultimate goal. That makes me like him a little more than if he was like purely out for vengeance.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Campbell's story circle has like a reluctant hero every time, right? Isn't that?
That's true. Yeah, the call to action, and then you resist the call. Right. So I think that's also mirrored in the duel that we see happen, where Paul fights in a way in which he doesn't really want to kill the guy, which I know we'll get to this, but like that reluctance to end the life, I think, mimics that reluctance to want to be this war hero. And I think that is smart in, like, again, making Paul a more likable character in our eyes, because we do know that there's a sort of artifice to this position, because the Bene Gesserit have planted these seeds throughout the galaxy, basically just as like little safe havens for themselves if they happen to get stranded somewhere. And yet the Fremen have built this whole belief structure around it. So it's hard to like not look at that and like be cynical about it. One thing I did read that was interesting, I looked into Herbert a little bit more, watched some interviews, read about him, and his second wife, Beverly, who he met in a creative writing course, was his first reader and a big supporter of his, and helped a lot with the characterization, and I read especially of his female characters. And the character of Jessica is largely based off of her.
Wow.
So a lot of what Jessica does, I think, is sort of inspired by her. And I really like Jessica as a character, so I find that fascinating. And then Herbert's parents, his father, I believe it was agnostic, but his mother was Catholic. And specifically, he was raised and he learned from these Jesuits, these women who were Jesuits. And apparently the Bene Gesserit is kind of largely inspired by the Jesuits' faith. Yeah.
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, I didn't either. So I thought that was kind of a cool little note. So he uses a lot of his own life and a lot of his own experiences to inform it. And speaking of learning about him as a person, I saw some interviews where he was talking about how we needed to switch away from fossil fuels into renewable energy. And this was, in the 80s, 70s, like a long time ago. He's already talking about renewable energy. He had this thing where he lived on an experimental home that was like run by a wind turbine and solar panels and all this different stuff. He like farmed his own food and he was like trying to be super fully self-sustaining, and so he was super into that stuff early on. Very critical of the government, didn't think that people should trust their governments, which I thought was interesting. He grew up in the time, or he was talking about it in the time of Richard Nixon, and I think he liked that it opened people's eyes to being skeptical of their leaders, and he was very wary of people getting behind their leaders and sort of throwing in with them and believing them whole cloth. And because of that, he was very skeptical of heroic figures. And I thought that was interesting because he's setting up Paul to be this chosen one hero archetype, but he's questioning it, right? And I think he's saying should people fall in line behind somebody like this and believe in them? And I think when it's built on this foundation that's kind of false, it makes this role stand out a little from what we've seen elsewhere.
Yeah, I do expect there to be a twist along the way. Of course, some of these prophecies are going to come true, and he's going to be this chosen one to lead them to hopefully a better Arrakis for everyone. But I think there's definitely going to be some turmoil along the way when they realize that something's going to come up. And I think it has to do with Jessica, because she's clearly sort of starting to twist against him just slightly, some of the things that are going on, some of the things he wants to do. And I think that we're going to see some sort of reckoning from the fact that the Bene Gesserit are just selling lies to people in the hopes that something comes true eventually. Or even just, not even that it'll come true, that it'll just be a falsehood that people build their lives around and stuff.
That's an interesting idea. I do wonder if we're going to see the Fremen realize that it was sort of based on a lie.
Yeah.
Or if they're going to be true believers.
Well, if he's a skeptical figure, if Herbert himself is skeptical, I could see him sort of baking that into this story, because these people are telling lies and not believing a whole cloth, like you said, in their religion necessarily.
Or will Paul, is that going to be manifested in Paul's own inner struggle?
Yeah,
as he realizes what he's doing from where his power actually comes from, and maybe he'll feel conflicted about his decisions and how it's going to affect people's lives, and whether or not they should be believing in him as this messianic figure, which it's looking like he's going to become. Yeah. We're definitely leaning that direction.
So you brought up Herbert. I wanted to mention something. We talked last week about his research in the dunes and the importance that he was finding in conserving them, basically. And the scene that we'll get to, obviously the plot here in a second, but the scene when Jessica and Paul are, traveling through the dunes, and there's the section where she sort of falls in and he's losing the pack. The way that the sort of sliding effect of the sand in the dune is described, it's so specific that he's so acclimated with how the sand moves and stuff, and I could just visualize everything he was writing in that scene, and the way that they sort of had to let it cave in on itself almost for her to be able to pull herself out, otherwise she was just going to be smothered in it. And then they were able to get the bag out because of that. And again, seeing Paul sort of have this precog ability almost, where he's seeing some things beforehand but not every detail he needs, so things are still kind of up in the air.
I mean, I'm sure there are canonical reasons for that, but I did have a note where I was it feels like he can see the future, except for when it's important for the plot that he not see the future.
Yeah, I agree. I felt
there are times where he's a little bit blocked, and he's like, "Oh, I can't see the outcome of this.
What's going on here?" Yeah,
and it's
there's actually a name for it too. I forget what it's called, but there's he even named it and was when I can't see the future, it's
I can't remember
yeah.
either. So that part you're talking about, that reminds me of a little anecdote. I mentioned last week that I was hanging out with Remy Nakamura, and he told me that, are you familiar with the Fatboy Slim song where Christopher Walken is doing that wild dance in the music video?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the name of the song off the top of my head, but I can I can see it in my mind's eye. Yeah,
I can't remember the name of the song either.
Yeah,
off the top of my head, I should have looked it up. But one of the lines in that song is like, if you walk without the rhythm, you won't attract the worm. Wow. And it's a reference to this book because you remember them talking about how they have to walk like
out
step,
of sync,
pause, step, slide, whatever. And apparently so cool. That's a specific lyric in that song referencing this.
I'm going to have to go listen to that. That's awesome.
So check that out. Speaking of other references, we were talking about this just randomly this last week, and out of the blue, we were talking about the mentats, and I was like, I think there's a drug in the Fallout franchise you take called mentats that makes your mind like really powerful. I think it gives you like a +2 intelligence or something. And I was like, is that a reference to this book? Or is it both? Are they both referencing something else? And we looked it up, and sure enough, it's a reference to Dune. So it's just fun when you can start making these connections in something in like media that you've already been steeped in and just didn't know that was what that was. Yeah. You know, like all this time I've been thinking about mentats. So when I read mentat in the book, I kind of had this like intelligence idea already.
Right. Well, it has that part of the mental word as well. Yeah. But sense. I wonder if Stimpaks are from Fallout, right? I wonder if Stimpaks are like
I don't know what that's from. Yeah, that's a good question. Anyway, cool stuff. I do have some summary to read. I ended up having to find a slightly different summary than I was using last week because it was very, very brief on this whole middle book. So I found one that's a little more expansive just so we can actually talk a little bit more about what actually happens. And it's going to be divided into 3 paragraphs. So here we go. So Idaho dies defending Jessica and Paul, and their ally Liet Kynes is taken prisoner during their escape. Now this is kind of going a little bit back, I think, into the previous section, but I figure that's okay. So Halleck, believing them dead, joins up with a smuggling outfit. Jessica and Paul are on their own, without supplies, in the harsh Arrakis desert. During their escape, Paul inhales a quantity of spice, which enhances his genetics and training to afford him some abilities of foresight with potential futures laid out before him. After arduous travel through the desert, in which they survive a sandstorm, an avalanche, and a giant sandworm, Paul and Jessica find a Fremen siege, led by Stilgar. The Fremen are a hardy and honorable people who live in communities across the Arrakis deserts that are governed by strict moral, political, and religious codes. Paul proves himself to the Fremen by fighting in single combat, while Jessica proves herself a powerful religious figure who is soon adopted as the Siege's Reverend Mother. Jessica, who is pregnant with Leto's daughter, Alia Atreides, ingests the water of life in a ritual to become the Reverend Mother. This change affects Jessica and her unborn child by giving them both collective ancestral memories of the Fremen Reverend Mothers. I guess we don't know that about the daughter yet.
I mean, I was pretty certain.
But it seemed clear. Likely, right? Because she mentions, like, they mentioned, like, oh, you should have told us you were pregnant because that's going to do something to the child. Luckily, it's a woman.
And yeah, Jessica kept thinking, like, during that whole process about how it was like changing her unborn child and undeveloped, and it was just very, very interesting stuff. Let's jump back up to the top though. So Duncan Idaho, I did not expect to die this quickly. It's tragic, right? Like, he's kind of a cool figure. It's gonna be a big hit for sure. Like,
remind me who's playing him in the movie.
That was Jason Momoa.
Oh, it's Jason Momoa. Oh, people are gonna be devastated. Yeah. So he. Sorry for the spoiler, I guess.
I mean, like, you're here for you're already in the spoiler.
You're already in the spoiler category. You're in the middle of the book, So
yeah, to see him go down, and he was like, it seemed like he was sort of the top of the 3. You know, I think the 3 who were sort of the right hands of Duke Leto, his aides. He seemed like sort of obviously more combat oriented, whereas some of the other ones were more advisors in different ways. But he seemed like one of the top people within his government, and so to see him go down, obviously it was for a good cause to continue to allow Paul to continue his journey, but just so quick and so sudden, and he's already dealing with the death of his father. Then he has one of his closest like aides who's helped him like develop his skills over time go, and then they're like they have to escape, and this Kynes has a whole thing that we'll get to, but so they're at Kynes' facility when all this happens, and then they have to basically flee into the desert, and everyone kind of thinks that they're dead,
right?
Because they're out there just in a sandstorm, and it's a rough spot because they also, I think, are having to kind of adapt to the fact that they haven't used these still suits very much,
right.
and dealing with that. And I love the description of like their lips and what it does to your nose over time, and like how it's just like uncomfortable, and of course it would be if you're not used to it,
right?
And that whole journey through the desert was pretty harrowing.
Well, and the descriptions of the desert is pretty beautiful. You know, like I love the shifting sands, the moonlight, just the environment is really evoked. It transports you to Dune, which I think is like, that's one of the things we all want when we read science fiction, right? Like we want to feel like we're somewhere new and exciting. And I definitely get that vibe from Dune. So I can see why people fall in love with that, right? And then when they're out in the desert, which is also like, it's so cool to take such a giant story in scope and shrink it down to just Jessica and Paul together,
right,
trying to survive on the desert.
Yeah,
and I love it when George R. R. Martin did that with certain characters in his books too. Like you just pair them off and you have them together on the road, right? And you get to like
Jon and Tyrion.
Yeah, you get to like experience the world from like a smaller scope, even though big things are happening. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I'm sure he's inspired. We've talked about from this book, because clearly he was doing this long before, but it works really well. And I like whenever the worms show up, I'm always like, paying attention.
So,
it's very exciting.
So exciting.
And then they're they see one that's like way bigger than any of the other ones because they're in the deep desert, and they're like, oh, they're even crazy big, like way bigger out here. And I do. It's interesting that like Paul keeps getting this thought of like, I shouldn't be afraid of them. I should respect them. Maybe be a little bit wary of them. I can see. Oh yeah, you can smell the cinnamon. Yeah, which is also cool because like that's something we can all do. So like, if you wanted to have a Dune party, just like throw cinnamon on everything. Yeah. Just throw it in the fucking air. Right. Cinnamon candles burning. Yeah, that would be awesome. Well, yeah. So these worms, he's like, well, I don't know if we should really fear them, but I mean, obviously they're scary, and they have to use these thumpers to get them to draw them away, and which create this rhythmic thumping sound to go against the kind of. It's described that the non-rhythmic movement is supposed to make you sound like a thing of the desert, because like the desert doesn't move with rhythm,
right?
Which, yeah, again, I'm not sure that that's true, but it's interesting, right?
That's cool. I'll take it. Yeah. I like the thumper. The idea of it too, like, is a cool invention. And then so they kind of have set one up.
I kept thinking about Tremors, man.
Yeah, kind of.
Which I'm sure is inspired by Dune,
probably,
right? Like,
yeah. Things in the dirt. Yeah, things in the sand.
I bet it was. Yeah.
So as they're traveling too, they get to this point where there's a thumper that they've set, but they're getting too far away from it, basically. And then a worm kind of comes after them, sort of, or is seemingly going to. And then that's when they start to hear another one, and they head towards it, and come to find out it was the Fremen. Yeah. And they're like basically summoning. They can call the worms to them with using different sounds.
We find out that they call them makers, right?
Yeah.
And essentially they, as predicted, it seems like they're very important to the creation of the spice.
Yeah.
And there's even little makers. They talk about little makers, so you can like a bunch of little worms down underneath the soil, like producing spice, and also maybe other things. I don't know.
So unclear. I kind of got the implication that we'll get to the kind stuff, but like what happens to him and that sort of boil over that happens.
Yeah.
They're also I think they're intertwined with that sort of thing, because I think it's like a buildup of carbon dioxide,
gases and stuff. Yeah. That is going to be essential to terraforming essentially the planet.
Right. Yeah.
They know this is important, so the worms are a key creature in the sort of ecology of this planet. All really fascinating stuff, and I love that it all plays into this ecology stuff I was reading about and listening to with Herbert. Like, he's really into this stuff. So this all leads to them joining up with the Fremen, and I love the new character of Stilgar that we meet.
Yeah.
He's immediately so likable. Like
So-
he gets like taken by Jessica, and she's got like a knife to his throat or something.
The Gonjabar, right? She like says she sort of references the Gonjabar, and he's familiar.
Yeah. But when she has like the knife or whatever it is like to him, he keeps like talking, and I love the way Herbert writes that section because he doesn't say, and then she like applied more pressure to him, and then he's like, ah. Instead, he just does the voice stuff. Like, he has him talking, and then he's like, oh, no need to do that, woman, or whatever. Like, he says stuff like that, and, like, you can just imagine that she's kind of jabbing him a little bit more or applying more pressure, and he doesn't have to describe any of it. So I thought that was cleverly written.
This is also another look at the fact, I think her Bene Gesserit abilities are, like, also can manifest physically.
Yeah.
In certain ways, which we see more of later. And that's something to think about with Paul, too. Like, what he's been able to sort of get from her. And I mentioned in the first episode how she had more experience with some of these powers, and just like she was more worldly, she'd been around for longer. And you start to see that in this section as well. Like, Paul is, as much as he acts like he's an adult and he has everything figured out and he has this like premonitions and all that stuff, he still does act like a 15-year-old or whatever every once in a while.
15, so young.
Yeah.
I mean, he seems very mature for his age.
Yes.
I think it's safe to say that much. But yeah, at times, I think you're right. And I do like that she is way more perceptive about the cultural stuff, that she's like, we're going to have to adapt to this culture. And she's immediately realizing, like, we're going to need to do this. You're going to need to do this.
I love the, like, sort of unspoken signals that they can give each other, too. Like, there's sort of nods and looks of knowing looks and things like that.
Yeah.
And, like, I love that intuition stuff with Bene Gesserit stuff.
Yeah.
They have.
Jessica continues to be a really cool character that I just really like. But, yeah, the way that she interacts with Stilgar is really cool, because there is also almost an attraction there, it seems like. Yeah. You know, she's like, oh, he clearly would consider taking me on as a wife after this whole throwdown, and he's like impressed with her, because at first he was ready to like discard her, like she's not important. But then after she proves that she could like best him and like get the jump on him, he's like, oh, she could get the jump on any of us then, because I'm like one of the best fighters we have.
That's sort of how he explains that, like, that's how the Fremen society goes, like sort of the strongest can tend to lead. Yeah,
kind of warlike. You see this a lot in fantasy, right? Like, there's this society that in many ways is advanced, but in other ways is very tribal and very archaic. There's like these blood duels that Paul gets involved in, and I guess let's get to that. There's this character, Jameis, who is kind of like giving him the stink eye a lot, and seems to be questioning his, whether or not they should be listening to him and letting him live. And then finally, he has to have this blood duel with the guy. The guy challenges him, and she's told that she has to be quiet because they realize that she has powers. It's like she has witching powers. Right. So she has to be quiet the whole time, so she can't do anything. And they fight, and I don't know about you, but this is one of my favorite moments from this entire chunk of book. I love a good fight in a book. Like, I'm a sucker for that. I'm excited to see how this looks in the movie, but we find out that Paul's training has really paid off, because he's extremely talented and quick, and he's got these like abilities to see the future, and I think that's helping him in this fight. And then the only thing that is holding him back is that he's fighting as if the guy has a shield, because he's always learned to fight shielded opponents where you have to attack more slowly. And that gives the guy these openings to get away from certain strikes. That's all really cleverly written. Like, it's almost like he's fighting with a handicap, and yet he's still kicking this guy's ass. And who's this amazing Fremen fighter? Right.
But I do love that, like, with all of the skill and all of like the diplomatic ability he has, and the way he can speak to people, and it ultimately comes down to this like primal fight. Yeah. Because like it is kind of to show both sides of the coin. He's been trained by Duncan and all the other aides to Leto. And then now we get to the point where he has to like put them all into action, and we're seeing him develop these psychic abilities for the most part, and then we're also seeing him how he has developed as a fighter, and he's in a and then in the society where fighting clearly will make you a leader potentially, he's also good at that. So
yeah, and it all works, right? And then he wins this fight. He wins the admiration of the Fremen. There is a line that Jessica gives that I really liked, where she a couple times says beginnings are times of great peril.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really clever line. It's like there's a lot of stuff that you could use in your day-to-day life in this book.
Yeah.
You know, it's like I'll be thinking about that, like beginnings are times of great peril, like because nobody knows yet what things are going to be like. You know, when you're first meeting somebody, there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong there.
Yeah.
And that's what she's thinking. Like, we're first meeting these Fremen. Someone could get killed before we have a chance to explain the situation.
I think that also could be said for that line. Could be said, beginnings are times of such great peril, could be said for a lot of the characters that we're seeing in this section too, because we're seeing new beginnings for Jessica, which we'll get to, new beginnings for the Baron's nephew that you talked about earlier, Fade Rotha. Yeah, new beginning for Paul with some of the things that he goes through, and then the girl that we meet
thematically,
Cheyney.
Yeah, it works. Cheyney, I think is how they say it. Well, that's how they say it in the audiobook. Cheyney.
Okay, Cheyney.
Yeah, which, by the way, she's part of this Fremen group. And we meet her, and at first she's just described as elfin, which I thought was interesting. Like,
you can just reference elves.
All right. She's elfin, this elfin figure. It is kind of fitting, though, from the casting that we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, we come to find out, a little later, that she is the daughter of Liet Kynes.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool reveal. And also that Liet Kynes is not just the planet ecologist, but like the leader of the entire
god something, god
he's
emperor.
He's a god leader of the entire Fremen.
Yeah.
And I guess he was kind of in secret.
Yeah.
Which is cool, right? Like, I don't know, I really like that. And then she's his daughter. And she's just lost her father, and it seems like
we should talk about that as well. The Kynes scene was fascinating to me.
So he's left to die in the desert, basically.
They kind of made it look like an accident. The Harkonnens,
yeah.
They make it look like he crashed one of the ornithopters, and he's like he has no still suit. Mm-hmm. He's traveling through the desert, through the dunes on his own,
hoping the Fremen are going to find him.
Right.
Which, like, I was kind of like thinking they were going to. Right.
Me too. Yeah, and he's sort of being like berated by the ghost of his father.
Yeah.
Who was also the same kind of like planetologist.
I was so confused. I thought it was going to like be revealed that like it was actually some sort of bot or something. Like I was
it's like an Obi-Wan moment. He's like, use the Force.
But it's like it's just a ghost, I guess. Or maybe I don't know, there's some implication that maybe people are like reborn in the creatures.
Could be, yeah.
I don't know.
Definitely some mysticism stuff going on.
Yeah, it seems like there is.
He also could just be hallucinating, losing liquid, losing hydration in the desert, and then the ghost of his father tells him like you should have. He sort of says like you should have moved faster. We still needed to terraform the planet. We need to get it turned over, and then he starts telling him about this like build up underneath him. He's like,
which is the reason that it seems like it's more than just a hallucination.
Yeah,
because that ends up being true.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And scary stuff too. And of course this will come back. This sort of build up is gonna have to come back. It'll be used in some way, or it will happen again at some point in the novel, or maybe further novels like sequels. But the build up underneath him while he's hallucinating, it's there's a lot of like this trippy stuff that goes on too when Paul is like taking spice, when Jessica is drinking the water of life or whatever that is later that we'll get to. So this is another like psychedelic moment, but it's sort of, he's like seeing visions. Overall, this scene is like really sad because I didn't know he was gonna die at the end of the scene.
Yeah, we just found out who he really is.
Yeah,
and
he's extremely important. Yeah. Like he's also the connection that he has with Paul already.
Yeah, but we're creating power vacuums. Right. Which is so essential in a story like this.
New beginnings.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. You have this younger generation stepping into these larger roles. And I feel like that's such a quintessential fantasy sci-fi thing to happen.
Changing.
So whenever you're reading, listener, whenever you're reading a sci-fi book or a fantasy novel, and there's some like honorable, wise leader of the family, don't fall in love with that character.
Or do and know that it's going to be heartbreaking.
Things are probably not going to go well for them because that you have to like so often you have to kill the leader of the family so that the younger ones can take on greater roles. It's just an easy way to go in these books, and it works.
Yeah, it's powerful.
Yeah, especially in a book filled with combat and violence and warfare, and especially this kind of like family dynamics. It just makes sense. You're gonna have assassinations and stuff, right? Like that's essential. So one other section that we talked about here in the And the summary is the consuming of the water of life. And I think it actually happens a little later in the plot, but we'll talk about it now because it was in the chunk I read. The water of life, she ends up drinking to become a reverend mother, which is like a leader in their society, but also a leader in the Bene Gesserit in the same way. And it's like slightly different, but also kind of the same.
Well, we met one early on, right?
Yeah.
That was the person who tested Paul.
Right, but they're different because this is the Fremen's Reverend Mothers.
Right.
And so she meets them and ends up becoming one of them. And she does like a ceremony where she drinks this poison and has to use her power to make it not poison.
Yeah.
And that's like the test, I guess, right? Because if you can't do that, then you're not worthy.
To manifest powers like this is something that I didn't know that Bene Gesserit or anyone would be capable of.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, she does. She's basically a wizard.
A wizard or
a witch.
A witch.
A witch.
Or a Messiah figure, like changing water to wine type thing right here. Changing a liquid over.
I didn't catch that. Yeah, I like that. She changes poison into not poison.
Water. Well, and then she drinks it, and then she becomes this, like, she feels herself changing. There's a full-on change that happens.
She trips balls when she drinks it.
And again, she's tripping balls while she's pregnant. Yeah. And also then the other older Reverend Mother, like, fucking is absorbed into her.
She gets all of her knowledge and all the knowledge of all Reverend Mothers.
Right. And so the Reverend Mother, the older Reverend Mother is like, oh, you're pregnant? You should have told us that. And so, like, this child just being, like, just pelted with the things. Well,
that reminds me of.
What's that?
Are you familiar with the Highlander franchise?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
When you chop the head off of the Highlander, you like absorb their powers, but also I think their memories and shit, right?
Yeah, I think so.
And then and then also of anyone they've killed previously. And so the idea is that over time there will be one Highlander who has all of the exactly.
There can only be one.
And I was just thinking how, like, I wish that was something like you read a novel of an author, and then you absorb all of their you consume them. No, you absorb all of their writing skill.
That would be awesome,
right? Yeah. And then
you kind of do, though,
and then all of the writing skill that they've absorbed in their life. Maybe you do. Maybe there can be only one ultimate writer one day.
I think that's the standing on the shoulders of giants things, right? Like, we're all learning from the people before and sort of finding our own way.
And truthfully, that makes it sound way more cutthroat than writing really is. But it's just funny to think that there is something to be said for, like, you can learn from the lessons that other people have learned. Like, that's kind of how society works.
Definitely.
And we're seeing that in magic form here as she's able to immediately get all this knowledge just loaded into her brain like the Matrix.
It felt a lot like when Paul first got the spices too, and he was getting these, like, crazy future trips that he was going on, and it's also interesting because, like, she talks about trying to hold on to her, like, oneness because like she was becoming many,
loses herself. Yeah.
And so, like, you could see a character coming out of this being like these characters that we see often. That almost Dr. Manhattan type character that has to, like, knows everything, is everything, and almost removes themselves from society in ways because they can't relate to the humanity of it all anymore. Yeah,
maybe her whole body will turn blue, not just her eyes. Yeah. We didn't talk about the blue eyes last time.
No,
no whites.
Yeah.
Is that how we're gonna get it in the new movie? I can't remember from the trailer if they had the full blue eyes or not.
I assume so.
Yeah. That's such a, like, essential look for this series, right? Very cool stuff. So Paul and Jessica learn that the Fremen are more numerous and powerful than commonly thought. The Fremen escape the Emperor's eye by paying the Guild to largely ignore their movements on Arrakis. They also work to return Arrakis to its ecology with lakes and oceans, a collective goal that drives their individual and societal obsession with reclaiming and storing water from their environments and their own bodies. The Fremen come to view Paul as a messianic figure, Mahdi, who was promised long ago. Although Paul and Jessica recognize this myth as a Bene Gesserit construct planted in Fremen culture. Due to Fremen's liberal use of spice, Paul's cognitive abilities continue to develop, while he also becomes physically sharper and stronger due to the tough Fremen lifestyle. Paul is concerned by the visions he has of becoming so powerful that a religious crusade will sweep the galaxy in his name. During his time with Stilgar's Sietch, he also falls in love with a young Fremen woman named Cheyney.
Real quick, you mentioned how they store water, and I wanted to talk about when someone dies. This is something big. When Jameis died, they, like, all the water in his body, they took it away to sort of, recycle that water, use the water that was in his body. and it was Paul's to sort of decide what to do with. And Paul like cries over this person that he's killed.
Funeral scene is really touching, actually. Yeah.
And that was a scene where I think a lot of Fremen came to respect Paul because again, seeing the humanity, he's crying and they see it as like giving up your moisture. They can't even imagine crying because they do this. They do like a grieving thing where they put like a small piece of cloth around their arms to like let people know that they're grieving rather than like crying to show that.
Because you got to conserve your moisture.
Yeah.
But they see him as he's giving moisture to the dead, and that's this like he's honoring the dead, and it's this guy who he didn't really even know. And so I think, he earns a lot of respect when he does that. And
then he sort of has to weirdly take on, like, he has to decide whether to make Jameis's partner his servant or wife. And then he also has to take care of Jameis's children and sort of, he, doesn't make her his wife. She's like a servant.
She's like a servant, yeah.
And then it seemingly he's going to take care of the children whenever need be.
Yeah, that's the implication. So he takes on this role, and he it's the first person he's killed. We learn like he's never killed anybody before, during all of this, he's starting to like have some interactions with Cheyney, but we don't get a lot of direct him and Cheyney getting to know each other. It seems like it happens kind of off page a lot.
A little, yeah, I do agree with that.
It's like they pair off and go off, and then Jessica's doing something else, and Jessica then she sees them talking to each other, and she's worried about it.
Right away. Well, there was a status thing, kind of also. Like the first reaction was, why is he singing a love song to someone so lowly as her, or something like that, which I was like, ooh, Jessica.
And then she's like, oh, I was a concubine, but I was more important than a concubine, and it was kind of odd. She almost seems jealous in a way. Of like
she's just worried,
stealing
obviously.
Paul's affections, but also like worried that he's going to get beguiled by her. I don't know. It seems like those two are going to maybe butt heads in the future. Is my guess.
Probably all three of them. Yeah, Paul's like going to obviously fall in love and push back.
He's starting to have some doubts about Jessica because in his visions it seems like she's one of the key figures in starting this jihad that he doesn't want to have happen.
Which is surprising because she has been this character who doesn't like. She's not like hard line with the Bene Gesserit's like teachings necessarily. She's done her own thing at different times, so. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see her not want Paul to do the same, to do whatever he wants to do in certain ways.
Yeah. Well, I can see her wanting vengeance over Leto.
True.
I can see her thinking that the Harkonnens need to be destroyed, and seeing the power that Paul is able to harness through the Fremen. She probably starts to think like, we have to use this. So I can see her like maneuvering in a way where she thinks it makes sense to start this war.
Yeah.
Not really caring about how many people are going to die because of it.
I
mean, that's a big, in real life, right? Like that's often the question of like war in general, right? Like if you have a war that seems justified, yet is going to result in all this death, you have to weigh that against how much death and suffering is going to happen if you don't do the war.
Right.
And the long-term effects of like creating like generational
trauma.
Trauma, conflicts, enemies.
Yeah.
And that's something that like, God, like so much has been thought and written about that. And I don't know that I have a strong sense of what I even believe when it comes to that stuff, because it seems like, of course, there are times where you have to go to war, right? Like if,
you have to fight.
World War II, like concentration camps, like certain things, it's like that has to be stopped.
Right.
But then it's like you can create situations where it ends up being worse over time. I'm not saying in that situation, but like look at the Middle East and like, well, because what we're talking about here, right? With Dune, I think he's kind of drawing on some of this stuff.
Right.
Now this was before a lot of this, right? So it's almost prophetic of what happened. So it's really fascinating to think about it that way.
You did talk about vying for like, or maneuvering at least, and I wanted to talk about like the Fremen actually sort of using the guild, who are fascinating to me. The guild that we've heard a little bit about the guild.
Yeah, I feel like we don't know a lot about them.
But the maneuvering to sort of escape the Emperor's eye, and we get some more of like the Baron's interaction with people who are associated with the Emperor going forward, but obviously clearly very powerful. But there's also like this thing where it seems like everyone wants to be the Emperor, like Paul has like ideas that eventually he's going to be this galactic leader and like lead crusades to fight against everybody. people will rally behind him and stuff. But then even like the Baron sees himself, the Baron's nephew sees himself as like potentially the Emperor. So everybody, that's going to be a big thing, I think, also, is like the power vacuum or whatever happens on Arrakis also affects everything in the galaxy, seemingly.
It's almost like, this sort of hierarchical government where one person has absolute authority isn't a good one.
Yeah. Yeah, hey.
So much sci-fi and fantasy has been written about how, maybe this isn't great.
Yeah,
maybe this isn't a good way of doing government. What was your impression of Cheyney now that we've met this love interest? He's had these dreams about her. He finally meets her and he's like, ooh, what do you think of her so far?
So this obviously, it's hard to look at this and not think of like a Pocahontas situation or something like that, where it's like this white guy coming into this culture and being like accepted and finding a love interest, and like it's a little like ooh.
Yeah.
Her as a character I enjoy though, and I like that.
You?
I do, yeah. I like that.
I don't feel like I know her.
Really? Even near the end?
What is she? She's done so little.
Yeah.
Yeah, she does a little bit at the end. You're right.
Yeah. Nearing the end of this section, I like the sort of their interactions, and they're both in mourning over their fathers and stuff. They have that common thing, which is like obviously pretty heightened state of emotions, but like she seems to just be cool and like understand like how to
she's just cool, man.
She's cool, but she's like,
she's supportive, cool and supportive, and hot.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's again problematic probably. She's supposed to be this like desirable character for a main character.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, we just met her and she hasn't done a whole lot yet, and maybe I'm gonna give the benefit of the doubt, maybe she does a ton in the third part here.
She just seems capable. Obviously she seems capable within the society. She seems well respected. She's the daughter of this important figure as well, and
smoking hot.
So I'm sure that's the implication. Yeah, but she is 15, so we didn't. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Yeah, but I think we'll see. I mean, Paul is into it though. Like they go off to like.
Well, the spice.
It seems like at the end
they're like tripping balls. Though.
Yeah, they're high on spice,
high on life.
Yeah,
high on water of life. Right.
Yeah. So it goes. All right, so I got a last little bit here, although this is the shortest chunk here, and it talks about the Baron Harkonnen. So meanwhile, Baron Harkonnen persists with his political scheming. He puts his nephew Rabban in charge of Arrakis, but plans to turn Arrakis' inhabitants against Rabban. This is so the populace will welcome Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, the Baron's favored nephew, as their leader. The Baron has also convinced Hawat, Duke Leto's Mentat, to work for House Harkonnen by convincing Hawat that it was Lady Jessica who betrayed the Duke. So that's interesting, right? Like this Hawat character who we've met is brought into Harkonnen's service because Harkonnen tells him like, oh, it was Lady Jessica all along, who he suspected. And he convinces him that she was the traitor. I
was surprised that he even would go with the Harkonnens. I was like, come on, really?
Yeah,
I think it's definitely a plant, right?
It seems like, I don't know, maybe he just agreed to do it, right? Like, he's so smart. He has to see that this isn't true, right?
There's something going on here. He's behind enemy lines, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I suspect that maybe he's not as bought in to this as.
Well, and then he has this whole situation where he like kind of convinces Feyd-Rautha to come and do this combat.
Right.
And then it seems like he may have fucked him over a little bit.
It's weird. It's like the guy's usually drugged, but now he's not drugged. And so it's more dangerous than it was supposed to be. Yet there's also this like key word he can say to like kill the guy.
Right. And there's like poison blade. He has like poison blades and stuff.
Yeah. I don't know. It's an interesting series of events. There were times in this book where I'm a little bit like, what is happening? Like it's kind of a lot.
It's a lot. I mean, and again, small period of time that we ran
in. Particularly this part because there's so many new characters.
Yeah, definitely.
You're meeting all these new people. The Count. And they're having these conversations and his style. Okay, so I shouted this out last time as something that I thought he did well, but I stylistically don't like it. And it's all the head hopping. Like it works, and like I get acclimated to it to where I'm okay with it, but it kind of takes some of the dramatic tension out.
It definitely does, yeah.
When you keep popping into people's heads and understanding what they're all thinking in a given scene.
Immediately,
like there's like not as much mystery. Whereas if you're tied in one person's POV and they're thinking about, I wonder what this person's planning or this person's planning, you immediately find out.
Right.
In the way because you pop over to their head and he explains what they're thinking. It's a very different way of doing it than we see these days.
It's more clinical. It feels like you can really understand we're God in this story. Like we understand everything. We know everybody's thoughts, and it leads to interesting interactions because like we get one of the main things I wanted to talk about with Fade Rotha is that he's so clearly the Harkonnen parallels with Paul. He's coming up,
and he does this duel, just like Paul did a duel. Yeah,
he's like you think
they're gonna duel each other?
Maybe I think they're gonna come into their own. How could they not? Right? They're both younger, taking over their like family members' role, and then they're both very capable. And then the Fenrings, like the Count and his and Lady Fenring, they mention even like what Fade Rotha could have been if he was. They were sort of saying, "Oh, it's unfortunate that he's being raised by these Harkonnens."
Yeah, and
like,
they're making him shitty.
What would it have been like if he was raised by the Atreides and like So like to draw those parallels, like there's something that's gonna happen.
So these I couldn't quite like. So who are these Counts and like who are they? Who's their allegiance to? The Emperor?
I assume so,
yeah. And I wasn't quite clear, and there was some Bene Gesserit stuff going on though too. They were talking about.
It seemed like the Count. So it seemed like the Count was over top of the Baron, in my opinion, or at least like somewhere like in that
just another
realm
house,
of power
maybe?
Potentially. But because they were talking about how like it would be easier to control different people if they became the next Baron.
Yeah.
So that's sort of
Harkonnen, man. Harkonnen doesn't seem long for this world either, right?
No, yeah.
Like
how could he be?
Everybody fucking hates him.
He's the target after, and I do like it's interesting to think that he's like positioning one of his family members to be like a piece of shit and everybody hate him, so that this other guy, Fade Rotha, like comes in as the hero.
Although I could also see him like fucking living out longer than all these people who think they're gonna bring him down.
Yeah, just retiring and he's just disappearing.
He's just this fucking ornery bastard who just outwits everybody because they all underestimate him or something, and they're like, this guy's a fucking fat, gross slob, because they all think when they look at him, he needs to die, and then he just gets the best of all of them.
It's mentioned a lot in this section as well. I was like, okay, I can see what you're talking about.
I don't know. I mean, I don't like him in the sense that he's not like a likable character, but I don't know. Maybe he'll. I don't know. He's either going to die immediately or he's going to outlive them all. I guess we'll see.
Yeah.
There's another part of Herbert's writing that I want to talk about a little bit and get your take on it.
Sure.
So he writes direct thoughts in italics. Have you noticed this in the book?
Yeah.
Occasionally he'll have someone talk in like a direct moment where they think, I don't know how else to explain it other than it's a direct thought, I guess. Like kind of monologue. Delivered in the first person, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's he's head hopped into them, and then he gives this direct thought, and it's in italics. This is kind of an interesting technique that I'm not a big fan of. I find narration to already be very internal. So whenever I see an internal thought, I'm like, why do we need to italicize it? We can just write it, and like we already get that we're in somebody's head. But maybe he's doing it because of the whole head hopping thing.
Yeah, maybe.
But even then, it's like sometimes it seems arbitrary to me when he decides to italicize and when he decides to just narrate something that is clearly in the thought of someone.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting.
I find it weird as a writer. Like, I don't personally do it very much. I tried it for a while, but I think I stopped doing it because I found it to be like too arbitrary. Mm-hmm. So I kind of don't like it, but I'm just curious like what your take was as you read those parts.
Herbert had to have had like an extreme desire for his readers to know everything that's going on. Maybe it's a way to make it more clear, like whose thoughts they are or something like that. But then again, like you said, it's in the first person, so they're not necessarily thinking.
You have to already be clear of who you are when you get them, right? Like you have to know whose head you're in, otherwise you won't know what's happening.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's when you're internal like that, you can do more of that trippy stuff where like they're losing their own like lucidity almost, like they're starting to like sort of fade into some sort of weird trip or something like that. Maybe you can play with that a little more in that first person sort of thing, but I don't know if that's...
One thing I can see is that he's doing this head hopping, and so he might worry that the narration is too distant. And this might be a way to get really in the head. Like, if we zoom all the way in and give direct thoughts in italics...
Super intimate.
Maybe it'll feel intimate, right? Yeah. Like, maybe it'll make you feel like you really know the character.
I can see that, yeah.
So I guess that in his defense, that's probably why he's doing it. It's just not personally a style I like, but it might be because he's also doing another style I don't like in the head hopping, whereas I personally don't like doing that either. So maybe that's... these are all of a kind with one another. I think that makes sense. So just a few other things here before we wrap. Another little writing thing I noticed he does that's like a throwback to another time. presently, he said, or he did this thing.
Oh, yeah.
Did you notice that?
Extra words.
It's just a weird it's literally the word presently.
Yeah.
And I've never understood why
It sounds...
writers from a certain era felt like they needed to say presently, as if we wouldn't realize that it was happening. If you said he walked over and picked this thing up from the table, you'd be like, when did he do that?
It's got to be just
presently. I must say it to the beginning of the sentence.
It's got to just be a holdover, right? Probably.
You know, it's funny. I read that he was a big fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs.
Yeah.
And
how could he not be? They're so similar. Yeah.
Right. And we covered him, and that was something he did a ton. Yeah. I think I even mentioned it in that episode on Princess of Mars, that he was constantly saying presently.
It's got to be a holdover. Like that's what he read growing up.
Probably.
And he just loved that.
That's
so
what
much,
an author does. Yeah. They say presently. Yeah, it's probably what it is.
Hold on to it.
I don't like it. Don't do it. Unnecessary word. I don't have like a huge hatred for adverbs that a lot of people do have, it seems like, but that one at the start of a sentence is so unnecessary. That one, get rid of.
A little weird for sure, yeah.
But, you know, it doesn't bother me too much because this is older writing, so I get it, but it's just, this kind of shit stands out to me. Couple other things. So there's a line where, during the fight, Herbert says, and this is something that Paul has learned, and is the terrified man fights himself. And I liked that, right? And he goes on to talk about how, yeah, exactly. No, it plays into that. About how, like, when you're terrified, like, you let fear build and become terror. Mm-hmm. And then when it becomes terror, you'll make mistakes. Mm-hmm. And then that will give you an opening in this fight. But I just like that, like, the idea of, like, remaining calm. Like, so much of it is, like, remain calm, let other people be afraid, let other people be terrified.
Right.
They'll get sloppy, they'll make mistakes. Handling fear is something that we're seeing a lot of talked about in this book. It seems to be something that Paul is very good at doing, or at least developing to be very good at doing.
It's almost a
Jessica's really good at it.
Mentat thing, kind of, too.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And then the last thing I just wanted to talk about was when Jessica gets buried.
Yeah.
We don't get, like, a direct experience of that. Like, we don't get her experience of being buried.
Right.
We get Paul looking for her more.
Right.
But it still made me think about just how fucking terrifying it would be.
So
to
terrifying.
Be swallowed by sand.
How often growing up did you think about falling into quicksand?
Quicksand, man. I mean, I know it's been said a lot on the internet, but like, you thought quicksand was going to be a lot more of a thing you had to worry about when you were an adult than it ended up being, right?
It felt like we were all just trudging through the Amazon, and we were going to have to, like, carry a rope on our person just to throw it.
So you got, like, Princess Bride has quicksand, right? Like, he dives into it. We had Never-Ending Story. With the horse
swamp
in the Swamp of Sorrows or whatever it was, getting sucked. It's not quicksand, but still.
Swamp of Sadness?
The idea of sadness. Yeah, you're right. The idea of just getting swallowed by sand and it just, like, going in your mouth and choking you out,
just drowning in
sand. It's like drowning in general, fucking terrifying. Like terrifying, but like drowning in sand almost seems worse. I don't know if it is, but it almost seems worse.
I mean, it's like it's because you can't move. You become immobilized.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what it is. It triggers my claustrophobia because I do have some claustrophobia, and the idea of, like, not only are you drowning in sand, you also can't move, and the idea of not being able to move is absolutely horrifying to me. Like, I hate that shit. So
totally,
that part was evocative, even though we didn't get, like, he didn't lean into that part of it, but man, like, that gets me a little bit.
That scene, I keep thinking about that scene a lot too, because Paul's, like, almost failing in that scene. It's sort of his fault that they end up.
Well, they lose a bunch of their gear, right? And he's like, "Oh fuck, we're gonna die now."
He almost but then he's able to get. He's able to get it
back with this foam, like foam stuff, where they're able to, like, build a way to dig into the sand or something and retrieve it.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff. Like, the tech in this book continues to be, like, plausible tech. It's like, I don't think it's, like, most of it's not real. It's just, like, plausibly described.
It's, like, surprisingly unique too. Like, it's not necessarily the same stuff that we've seen before.
Yeah, no, it seems, like, very custom to this situation.
Yeah.
I saw in one of the interviews I was watching, this guy was, like, asking him, like, were you, like, one of those brilliant science kids growing up? And he's like, no, I was more of a, you know, no, he was like, I was a farmer. I was, like, out, you know, working the fields and stuff, and talking about how he, like, going out in the woods and all that stuff. But he did say that, like, his key thing is that he's curious. Mm-hmm. And he only was in college for a year, yet he was talking about how he, like, they have him go give talks and stuff at these universities. And they're like, how are you doing this when you don't have, like, multiple PhDs? You know, you only had a year of college. And he's like, I've just always been curious. I've always read and, like, been willing to go talk to people and, like, knock on doors, is literally what he said in this interview.
Yeah.
And ask people. And so it seems
awesome.
like he's just really good at like seeking out the knowledge he wants and is interested in, and then putting that into his books. So if you're an aspiring writer out there like I am, that's a good lesson for all of us. Like, pay attention to shit and like things you learn, because you can put that in your books. And if you're writing science fiction or anything really, like it gives it like a lasting appeal. It gives it an educational quality, but then it also just, I don't know, it's clever. Like, if you can he's taking ideas and modifying them and just playing with it a little bit.
Yeah.
He gave himself enough room by making the science soft enough that he can kind of make stuff up. And that's definitely something I'm doing a little bit in my own novel. So
yeah.
I like the idea of that. Like, it seems kind of possible, but also it's kind of soft and squishy.
Right.
And that's kind of how I do a lot of stuff.
I love, so what you said about like having so much curiosity kind of triggered something in my mind, a little personal, but I'll tell it. I love sort of his ideology with that. I think that I strive for that. And I can remember like growing up, just like everyone always being like, you're so curious, you're such a curious kid and all this stuff. My parents had this ongoing thing every night before bed. I would get to ask them 2 or 3 questions, just any question in the world. And I would continually ask like how things worked, how this happened, how does a toilet work? How does an airplane stay in the air? Like all this stuff. And it's cool to think that like just carrying that into adulthood, like you should be like unabashedly seeking out this kind of stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you're even slightly interested in understanding how something works, like go figure out how it works. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Knowing
I
that
love
kind of
that
stuff.
idea. That's really cool that your parents did that. Have your kid ask questions each night.
Yeah.
Keep them curious. I agree. I think curiosity is like one of the best traits a person can have, and it's something that so many adults seem to lose as they get older, and it's sad.
Yeah.
Like, stay curious. Like, I want to continue to learn things until the day I die, literally.
100%.
Because like I find so much reward in doing that, and just learning and understanding more about my world and my universe and how things work. And that learning things also leads to more questions, right? It always does. Like, you learn how something works, but then you go like, well, what if this? And like, if this is how this thing works, then why doesn't this work? And that's just the way knowledge is. And I love that. And I love that made it into this book. And speaking of curiosity, I'm curious to see where this goes. Oh, also, I made a prediction last time. Not really. I mentioned that I had seen, I remembered from the movie, a scene of Paul maybe riding on a worm.
I still think,
and I feel like that's happening now even more, because confirmed the Fremen ride worms.
Yeah.
So I'm like, oh, okay, so that's probably fucking happening.
Yeah, 100%.
With hooks or something, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Do you remember there was also like a moment where there was a vision of a worm drowning in the water? I don't know what the fuck was happening with that. Anyway.
Metaphor. I mean, the idea of, I just love so much. I'm going to mention it again. I mentioned it last week, but the 2 planets that are talked about, like Paul's native planet, and then this planet, they're so different. They're so, it's an ocean planet, and it's a dune
couldn't
desert
be any more
planet.
different.
Couldn't be any more, and just the way that they play off each other is so cool. And just like I don't know, something about water and being adaptable in like, and then coming to a planet like this, and still moisture is the
well, it's also like abundance and scarcity, right? Like, he's from a place of abundance, of the thing that is scarce on this planet,
right? And it's almost becomes like a holy relic, water, like liquid water. I don't know,
but it's all artificial.
Yeah,
I don't know. It all plays into the themes that we've been touching on here, and I'm sure are going to be explored more in this as we finish out the book, and I'm sure through the rest of the series. If you enjoyed this episode and our coverage of Dune in general, please let us know in the form of a rating and review if you haven't already done it. If you have already done it, one thing you can do is like this video on YouTube, leave a comment, add us on social media. We're at Ink to Film on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Let us know that you're enjoying it. We like to interact with people on there, and we're good about responding for the most part as quickly as we can. Basically, it's me. Whenever I can see it, I try to respond. I'm traveling right now, but I'm sure I'll be bored on a plane looking at social media. So let us know that you're liking it. We love to hear that.
And if you want to support the podcast in another way, check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ink2film. And we have many different tiers, but for the $2 tier, just $2 a month, you can get access to our bonus content, which is normally a bonus episode every month. And we have like 40 of them. Yeah. And we will be doing the Dune 80s version, the David Lynch Dune film this month.
Yeah, after we finish the book out, we'll be watching that David Lynch movie and releasing a bonus on that. So if you want to be there as soon as that drops, if you like that movie and you want to hear what we think of it, that's where you're going to do it, Patreon. Also, we have a Discord which we have opened up to non-patrons. Anybody can join that now. You just need to get an invitation link. And the way you're going to do that is go on our Council of Inklings, where I'm going to post it regularly for people to join. And then if you don't want to get on there, you don't use Facebook or whatever, just reach out to us on any social media, and I'll send you a link. Just let us know you're a listener. I'm just doing that to keep the people who are in the Discord are actual listeners of the podcast. That's really all I want.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, man. All that's left to do is to walk without the rhythm so we don't attract the worm.
Yes.
I guess. I want to go listen to that song again, actually.
I will. Yeah, we'll listen to it together. Yeah.
Yeah, we'd play it now, but we'd get fucking copyright striked if we did that. So go listen to it yourself. Enjoy. And then we will be back next week to finish out the novel. And then the following week with the new movie. And we're hoping to have a very exciting guest on for that. So pay attention and look forward to that. And until next time,
keep adapting.